Hey viewers, welcome to episode 5 of my Matlab Programming course. Today we're doing the if loop. The if loop is once again a very simple loop that is very useful for, well, just about anything. And we're going to only look at the if loop. Keep that in mind, there are more loops that fill a similar thing, similar niche, I guess, in programming, but we're only going to watch the if loop. So we have 4 examples set up. We're going to dive into example number 1. So for those of you who don't know what an if loop is, an if loop basically compares a variable with a number, or well, a preset basically. And if the two are equal, or well, if it falls in the range that you set, it will go over the loop, so it will process the information inside the loop, otherwise it will skip the loop. So we will see here how that works. First of all, I set 2 breakpoints here. First of all, we're going to clear this screen, which is of course the standard thing to do in my tutorials here. Normally you don't really have to do that because you don't get as much output as I get. So my loop here is a for loop. We count from 1 to 50. We saw for loops in the last episode, so you should be familiar with that. So count is going to run from 1 to 50 with steps of 1. And when count, so if count is smaller than 20, we're going to run whatever is in here. Currently there is only this. It's going to state that count is and then a number, namely count. So if I run this, we're going to see that the first time it actually jumps in there, it is at 1. Obviously 1 is smaller than 20. So we will see that in later examples that actually comes into play, but let's continue on for now. And if I just process this, it becomes 1 to 19 and then it says done, because in the end it says done. So just seeing from this, I'm saying smaller than 20, so 20 itself is not included. If I want to include 20, I need to do an equal sign here, and then if I run it, you can see that count is 20 is there as well. So currently it runs like this, but if we want to make it a little prettier, we can do this and this. This one clears the screen after it enters the loop. So every time it enters the loop, it clears the screen. Then it will print whatever the count is, and then it will pause for 1/10 of a second. Pause is normally not very useful unless you want to have graphical effects in your well, in your box here, or if you want to have certain inputs from, well, the users basically. If I run this, you will see now it actually counts to 20, which is excellent. It really doesn't do anything else than that, but that is your if loop. So once it reaches 21, or earlier when it still looked like this, once it reaches 20 or higher, it is going to skip over this loop and it's not going to do anything. So basically this loops could be like this and it would do exactly the same thing, because all of the variables, all of the counts outside of 20 will be, well, just skipped. I'm going to keep it that way in case I need it later. But yeah, well, that's the if loop. So basically it states if something is something. So if this is true, basically, and well, that's the thing you need to remember. If your statement is true, it's going to run this. If your statement isn't true, it's going to go to the next statement, which we will see in the next example. And we will go to that now. As you can see, I have the same statement here. So the if statement is the same. But if this isn't true, so the count isn't smaller than 20, it jumps to the next one and it's going to check whether count is actually 20. And if it's 20, it's going to say count is 20, and it's going to pause for 1.5 seconds instead of 1/10 of a second. Then after 20, it is still bigger than 20, so the first one will get skipped. So it starts here again. The first one will get skipped because 21, where the count is at that point, is not smaller than 20. It's also not 20 itself. So it's going to go to this one and see if that is true. This one says if it's smaller than 40. Well, 21 is smaller than 40, so you can see that 21 to 40, it will do this one. And as you can see, it has a different sentence here. So you can see when it switches. And then when it reaches 40 to 50, so basically when it reaches 40, it will skip this one, skip this one, skip this one, and end up at this one, which states when it is 40. So, and when it's 40, the count is higher than 20, the current count is 40. That's what it will state. Then it pauses for 1.5 seconds, and it will continue on with 41. But 41 till 50, there's nothing to do, because our highest number is 40 in this. So basically it will skip all of the steps, immediately go from if to end, because none of these statements are true, and then in the end it will display done. So just to show you how it works, we're going to hit F5. It will clear this with the CLC, and so currently it steps into the first one. If we run that, it will count up to 19, because at 20 we go to else if count is 20. So it's going to clear, it's going to say count is 20, it's going to pause for 1.5 seconds, and then it's going to continue. So then it ends up at count is smaller than 40. So count is smaller than 40 is now true, because count is 20 means that the next one, our current count, is 21. So as I said, it skips the first, it skips the second, it gets to the third one. So now it says count is higher than 20, the current count is blah blah, up to 39. And at 40, which is our current count, it will go to count is 40. And if we run that, then I should have realized that this doesn't work. Let me see, that's what you get if you copy paste too much. Okay, run it again. We will see that it runs to 20. Well, it seems to run to 20. In fact, it runs to 19, then it does 20. Then it runs to 40, then it does 40, and then it skips everything. So, yeah, then it's done. So keep in mind, I made a mistake here. I put a space in here, and you can see that here. You will see it in a moment. Here there's a space now in front of this sentence, and it will disappear when it's here because I put a space here. So this is very literal. If you want to make these statements correctly, then you have to do the spaces correctly as well, because it's going to interpret them very literally. So if you put a space in it, he will put a space in it. So there's that. Anyhow, that's really all I have to say about this. But what if I wanted to add something else? So not just if and else if, but something else. Then we get to example number 3, which is this. And it is exactly the same thing, except that here it says else. So else, this is what happens if all of the other statements are false. So this one is always true. So if it runs from this to this to this to this to this, and then if all of that is false, this one is always true. So it will always be processed if none of the others get processed, which is a very smart thing to do. If you have a statement like this and you're like, well, I covered everything with if and else if, so I don't need an else. Just put else in here and just type an error message. So make it that it will print an error message that if it reaches this, so if it hits the else, then something went wrong. So putting an else in there is always very useful, because it will always get processed if one of the others fails. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to run this straight off. As you can see, once again, we're going to clear the screen here. And then we're going to run this. The first one, of course, is 1, which is smaller than 20. We saw this one, we saw this one. Keep in mind, we didn't see this one yet, because that is the last one. So I will run the 1 to 40. You can see it here. It is the same as last time. So now it's at 40, and currently count is at 41. At 41, it is not 40, it is not smaller than 40, it is not, well, let's start top. It's not smaller than 20, it's not 20, it's not smaller than 40, it's not 40, it's not 50, so all of these are false. So basically all of this is useless crap. It just skips that entirely because the statements are all false. So it's going to go to else, and else is going to print, still counting, the count is up to 41 now. And of course I shouldn't have done this. That's what you get for copy pasting once again. Yeah, so it will display the count is 41, and it will pause for half a second, which really doesn't matter since I'm stepping through it here. But this one hasn't really gone off yet. So if we run through it entirely, we will see that, well, once it reaches 50, it will actually go here. So even though this is before the else, so even though this has already run, it still ends up at count is 50, because all of my statements need to go before the else, because once it reaches else, it's not going to look at anything else, because everything that's below the else is going to just get processed. It is always true, as I said, so it will never skip that. So keep that in mind, that this one, even though it is the last number, is still before the else. It seems very logical for people that program a lot, but it really isn't if you're not familiar with programming. So basically every exception is placed here, and then the general thing is here. So the general thing is the thing you always do, and then if you have exceptions to that, you put them above it. So the smaller cases basically. And yeah, well, it's going to print whatever. This is the last one, count is 50, and then it's going to display done, because that is at the end of my program. So it becomes a little more complex, but we only have if, else if, else, and then the end, of course. We always end with end. Function can also be ended with end, so I can actually type end here, and as you can see, it will say that that belongs to the function. But you don't have to, because it's the end of the file. We will see in one of the later episodes how the function well, works if you want to have multiple functions in one file. But yeah, it's really not that common, because it's much easier to just make a different file and just call it from this file. It doesn't matter processing wise, so might as well do that. So example number 4 then, as you can see, this is a very big if loop. It is a nested if loop, in fact, with the inside of a nested for loop. So we have for, if, and as you can see, it just becomes, well, or it gets more and more to the right, so the indent becomes, the indentation, I guess, becomes bigger and bigger. So we're going to run through 2 for loops instead of 1. The first one says count 1 is 1 to 50. The second one says count 2 is 1 to 50, which means that we're going to go count 1 is 1. Then we're going to process this entirely. So count 2 will run then from 1 to 50, with count 1 staying at 1. And for every time that happens, I'm going to process this if loop, which has an else if and an else and then an end, and that's why you use that smart indent, because then you can see what belongs to what. But as you can see, it runs this if loop, and if this one is true, it will run this if loop, which also has an if, an else, and an end. So you can of course build more if loops if you want to inside of each other. But if you get to this one will be skipped entirely, because it will go from if, this one's only count is 10. So imagine count is 1, then count 1 is 1, I should say. If count 1 is 1, it's going to skip over this one, it's going to go to this one and see that count 1 is smaller than 30. So it's going to run this one. And this one has an if, else, and end as well. So you can see it becomes very complex-ish if you program it like this, and that's why there are other loops to actually, well, counteract this effect that you get. But just for the fun of it, let's watch through it. By the way, I did set pause time, which as you can see is used quite a lot, as the value of the pause between 2 executions. So I have here 5 times pause time, but you can do that with virtually anything. So my pause here is based on this variable, and here it is just 5/100ths of a second. Here it's 5 times that, so it's a quarter second. It's pretty easy to understand. Keep in mind that you can use variables inside of other functions as well. So not just your own functions, but also the Matlab functions. So running this, we are going to see that first it's going to clear the screen. It's going to set pause time, and then for count is 1, it's going to immediately go to count is 2, or count 2 is 1, sorry. And then it's immediately going to go to this if loop, which is fine. Then if we run this, however, we're going to see that it skips over this entirely, and it's going to this. I already told you this, but just to show you, it actually goes to this if loop. So with count 2 is 1, it will skip over this, because this one says if count 2 is bigger or equal to 10, which it isn't, and it is count 2 is smaller than 20, which is actually true. But this one isn't true. So one of the two is true, one of the two isn't true. But since it says n, it both has to be true for the entire statement to be true. So it's going to skip over this. Then it's going to say if it's smaller than 2, which it is because it's 1, or, and that's this one, it is bigger than 40, which, yeah, this one is true, this one is not true, but this time it says or. So this one is true if either one of them is true. So if the first one is true, or the second one is true, or both of them are true, then this one will run. So we will see that it starts to run here. And indeed it will run. It will say currently blah 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 in part 4. And we're going to just continue on. Well, now we are still in count 1 is 1, count 2 is 2. And yeah, this one says count 1 is 10. No, count 1 is still 1. So we are still in this part. As you can see, it says currently in part 4. That was the last step. We will see why I did that later. Yeah, currently with count 2 is 2, it is not this, it's also not this, because it's no longer smaller than 2, it's also not bigger than 40. So it will skip not only this one, but also this one, and it will actually just go to the else. And since else says do nothing, this is a comment by the way, for those of you who didn't pay attention last time, comments are with the percentage sign. So it says do nothing, because it's not supposed to generate an error. I just wanted to show you that it will actually go to the else, and well, then do nothing, because that's what it says. Then we will go on to count 1 is 1, count 2 is 10, and this one is now bigger or equal to 10, and it's smaller than 20. So because 10 is smaller than 20 and 10 is bigger or equal to 10, so it will actually execute this one now. And as you can see, it says currently in part 3, then count 1 is 1, count 2 is 10. Running through this, you will see it varies between 3 and 4 up until the point where one of the counts, well, count 1 in this case, reaches 10. Because when count 1 is 10, and that is right now, count 1 is 10, count 2 is 1, it will go to this if loop, or this part of the first if loop. So it will run this if loop, and it says if count 2 is bigger than 10, which it isn't, so it skips this. If count 2 is smaller than 2, that is true. So you can see that it goes to this one, because this one had the or, so this one doesn't have to be true. And it will run this. So I'm removing the breakpoints whenever it actually executes something. Then going from that onto, well, the next step basically, where count 1 is still 10 and count 2 is 2 now. So it now skips the first one and the second one, because once again this one is no longer true, this one is still not true, so it will actually just go to the else. It's very easy, I know, but you have to understand how this processes, because otherwise you're going to run into trouble if you don't know exactly how this works. Because every programming language has a different execution of an if loop. For example, some of the programming languages will fall from one into the other if you don't, well, put a break in there. So if you don't say, well, this is the end of where you should execute. But this one, so MATLAB, is really pretty straightforward, and that's why it may actually come across as a very boring piece of, well, software, or well, tutorial in this case. But it really is pretty simple. So you can really just read what it says. So if count 2 is bigger or equal to 10, which it is currently, and count 2 is smaller or equal to 20, which it is currently, it will execute part 1. And you will see it will now vary between 1 and 2. Yeah, there it goes. And that is because, well, the 1 it was dependent on, and now it's between 3 and 4 once again. The 1 is dependent on count 1, and the other is dependent on count 2. So yeah, that's why it varies between the two. So you will see it goes all through this, and then eventually, once count 1 becomes bigger than 30, because it will run this up until the point where it's no longer bigger than 30, smaller than 30, sorry. So once it becomes, and here you can see that count 1 is 31, count 2 is 1. It will run this else, because this one is no longer true. Hang on, this one is no longer true, so it will go to the else of that statement, and of course it will run into the first one. Yeah, but this one is not true. Once again, the 1 will execute this bottom one, the 2 will execute the else, and then once we reach 10 to 20 it will execute this, and then at 40 it will execute this once again. So it's really straightforward. It will run this one, then it will run the else, and then it will run the if. And yeah, it will keep running until it's done. So until both of the loops are done. So loop 1 to 50, and then this loop 1 to 50. So totally, there are a lot of possibilities that you can have with this. But this becomes very messy very quickly, as you can see from, well, just some simple statements. But if you do it correctly, this can really help you out in programming. And once it reaches 50 and 50, it says done, because then the program is done. So all in all, that's all I have to say about it. The if loop is not very complex. Just keep in mind that you have to be very careful with what you do and how you set up your if loops. So put in comments, put in, especially in the beginning, put in these comments of yeah, when this happens, or why you made this statement, because if you look at it a month later, you're not going to remember that. And this is very, very just complex to read. I mean, you can't really make any sense out of it unless you have comments with that. Also, this helps out quite a lot if you're having trouble with your if loop. Just make some statements and let it print wherever it is in your if loop. Let it show on the screen here where you are and when you're processing which variable and which part of your if. All in all, as I said, a very easy statement, but you can do very complex things with it. It's also one of the most versatile loops in the programming. Just like the for loop, both of them are very, very useful, but both of them can become very complex very quickly if you do it wrong. For loop is a little bit easier than the if loop, because you have for is just basically for. It just runs and that's it. The if loop becomes a little more complex, because you have if, else, and then you have to make all the statements inside of it and blah blah. Anyway, hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.